Well, good evening, everyone. I want to thank you all for joining us here tonight. I'm Pete Eberle with the Colorado Renewable Energy Society. And for those of us that are new, CRES and its local chapters provide education, policy advocacy, and community engagement that accelerate Colorado towards a carbon neutral future powered by 100% renewable energy. Founded in 1996, CRES is a statewide, nonpartisan 501c3 that is supported by our sustaining individual and business members, as well as donations. You can sign up for our newsletter, event announcements, social media, and become a member or donor at cres-energy.org. That's CRES-energy.org. Also, make sure to follow our YouTube channel, where you will find over 290 previously recorded presentations that contribute to our 1.45 million views. I want to give a special thanks to our business members: Poudre Valley REA, Centon Instruments, Platte River Power Authority, Solaris Energy, Sandbox Solar, Greystone Technology, and BrightSense Energy. So a couple of quick announcements before housekeeping and handing it off to Erik. Upcoming CRES events on Tuesday, October 14th, 6:30 p.m. in Boulder. We will have the Heat Pump Journey, One Homeowner's Story. We'll have David Petroy of NTS Energy and Neil Cowrie of Sweep, who will go through an evaluation of a homeowner's actual situation. It's kind of a case study. Then they'll use loveelectric.org as well as their expertise to evaluate heat pump options and show how to find qualified installers, get bids for the chosen heat pump pathway, and how to take care of the tax credits and rebates available. Obviously, the federal will be going away at the end of the year. Then on Thursday, October 16th, 6:30 p.m. at Odell's 5 Point Tap Room in Denver, we will have Accelerating the Clean Energy Transition in Colorado. This will feature Ron Sinton of the CRES Policy Committee. And it will kind of discuss the situation as the grid in Colorado exceeds 50% clean energy. At any time, it can be very clean or actually fairly dirty, depending on the weather and the time of day. And this presents challenges to grid operators, but also choices for electric customers. Ron will share his insights on these challenges, focusing on time of use rates, EV charging programs, and the renewable week ahead forecasts that enable faster progress and inviting customer participation and choice in ways that can lead to quicker and greater adoption of renewable energy at the lowest possible cost. So without further ado, Erik, I will hand it off to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Pete. And thanks for the opportunity to be here. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for spending your evening and dinner time here to learn about electricity market. And just a little bit of a shout out for CRES. We actually learned quite a lot from CRES in some of these webcasts when we actually recently built a passive house in Superior, Colorado. So a lot of these webcasts were actually really helpful for us when joining in, just kind of learning what passive. I did not know what it was when we started building, and just wanted to give that little shout out there to these types of events. So electricity markets, a little bit about myself. I've lived in Colorado for about 17 and a half years. I've been working on electricity markets and grid operations and planning for more than that, about 20 years. But for almost all of those 17 years here in Colorado, at the cocktail party, when I told people about electricity markets and what I do, they'd always have this question: "Oh yeah, that sounds great. We do that here, right?" And I'd be like, "Well, no, all the work I do is in other parts of the country or other parts of the world. It's a cool thing, but Colorado doesn't have these electricity markets." And so never really got that much attention at the cocktail parties. Well, that's changing, as many of you know, and has already changed to some extent with the energy imbalance service that is in place in a good portion of the state here today, and with the policy in place for the investor-owned utilities to participate in some form of a market, whether it's an ISO RTO or a day-ahead market by 2030. So I think there's been some presentations by SPP and by maybe others, they're kind of getting into some of the details of what that market is, what it means for Colorado. I'm going to be a bit more conceptual, talking about just how markets are designed, and talk a little bit more about kind of the specifics later on, but just to give a little bit of context on that talk. So did want to give just a brief overview of two organizations that I support. Electric Power Research Institute is an organization doing collaborative R&D for the utility industry. That's a lot of where in the past 10 years I've worked with all of the ISOs and RTOs across the US and Canada and other parts of the world, kind of helping guide them on how the markets are evolving, learning from them on the intricate details of their markets, which, as you'll find, are very complex, and there's lots of details, some very important details, but they make a big difference. But really kind of conducting the R&D for that for those organizations, including many of which here in Colorado. And then the Energy Systems Integration Group. I've been supporting this group for a number of years, but more directly in the last 8 months or so. In this member-driven organization, kind of looking at technical challenges to the power industry, putting together workshops at least 3 times a year on various topics, from grid forming inverters to transmission planning to interconnection processes and electricity markets. So that's those workshops are open to anyone that's that can register. So anyway, just a quick plug for those organizations. So I'm going to start very conceptual, and then we'll kind of get into more of the kind of the details of things. And I know there's even looking, see some familiar names on here, and I'm guessing there's a mix of people that know this stuff very, very well, and those that maybe haven't really heard of electricity markets before. So hopefully this will be useful for all of you, and try to get to some good ways of sharing things, maybe in different ways that even those that our experts haven't heard of before. So, first of all, the power grid, the electric power grid, whether it's the Eastern interconnection or here in the Western interconnection or out in Europe, often called the largest and most complex machine in the world. One time I had to change that to say the most complex man-made machine in the world, because someone raised their hand and said the brain, human brain's more complex. So I had to switch that. But, one interconnection, in the Eastern interconnection, or if you looked across the United States, 1 billion plus kilowatts of generation capacity. So you could do that in many different ways. 500,000 miles of transmission. All generators and motors spin at about the same time, at the same speed, at the same time. Electricity travels about at the speed of light. And a problem in Florida can be felt in Manitoba. Or a problem in northern British Columbia could potentially be felt here in Colorado. So very complex machine. But other than that, what makes an energy market or an electricity market so unique? Well, again, electrical energy cannot be stored, so there's no inventory like there is in other markets, and it can be converted to other forms of energy and stored and then used later, but that's with additional capital as well as efficiency losses, and there's very small amounts, with some of the batteries that we have and some pump storage hydro, some of which we have here in Colorado, but really there's not storage of that energy like there is in other commodities, where you can just kind of build a lot of things, put it in the warehouse, and then sell it when people demand it. Energy is generated and consumed at almost the exact same time. Electricity must be transported to consumers at the speed of light, often from far distances. The laws of physics will dictate where power will go, which path it will take, and how much of it will be lost along the way. So in other words, if the road is full of trucks, that means you can't deliver any more supply, but you also can't use a different road, even if there is a road. The laws of physics will dictate where power goes, and laws of physics tend to dominate, but the rules of economics will influence how resources are deployed, subject to all of their technical constraints. So economics and physics kind of have a battle, and that battle is very unique, the way that the electricity is delivered and how it's supplied and consumed by the end user. There are many different ways to supply it, so it's not just, you know, an apple where the apple market where it grows on a tree, and you know that's tree pretty much how you get it anywhere, and there's a grocery store and it's pretty much consistent. But we have a lot of different ways to supply electrical energy, but really the consumer is indifferent to the end product. When you turn on your light, when your air conditioning's running, you have no idea what supplier's behind that, right? So it doesn't really matter to you, just in terms of that instant that you're getting that. And some suppliers have large capital costs, low variable costs, but others are the opposite. And there's a lot of other characteristics that go in there. And then lastly, consumers rarely, if ever, are really exposed to the true costs happening on the power system. So you kind of have that market failure. So, you know, all that in mind, there's other things here, and we'll get into that. So, in light of the fact that when, you know, Pete and I were first talking, and there was a possibility that I would do this presentation, but we're not at Odell Brewing, I'm going to have I'll just kind of bring the brewery to you all. So, let's give this example. What if you went to buy a beer, right? So, have your generators there on the left, your brewery, and then there's the tap. You know, that's the load. You know, it's a simple one-line diagram of the beer market. So what if you went to buy a beer, and just think about what's the price for beer? You know, it's $5, it's $6, whatever it is. You know, it kind of just the same. You know, wherever you go, you know, some cities might have higher prices. But let's just think about how this beer market works. So what if you went to buy a beer, and the beer must be drank as soon as it was brewed? The beer could not be stored in the cans, the bottles, or the kegs. The beer taps would get congested, and they could no longer be delivered when you want to drink them. The head on the beer was necessary, but not all beers produce it. Some breweries are on a large lake where they can get the water to brew their beer. Other breweries could only make beer when it rains. So, yeah, these are the things that happen with electricity. So you could just think about that. Add all these things and think about, you know, okay, honey, I was going to go to the brewery, but it's been, we've had a drought for the last 3 days. I don't think they have any beer. So it looks like we're going to have to wait a couple weeks. You know, so anyway, these are some of the things, and just because we couldn't make it to the brewery tonight, I'll have to kind of bring that to our electricity markets characteristics. Okay, anyway, so that's just to start us off. So here's the agenda I really have for today. So talking about wholesale markets in North America, market structure, market design. We'll kind of talk about what each of those are, some common design characteristics. Then we'll talk about energy prices, you know, how those prices are formed and calculated. We'll talk about these other products in the electricity markets beyond energy. So things like ancillary services, talk about what those are, financial transmission rights, capacity markets. And then really what I do want to get to is renewables and electricity markets, and kind of tie those together. Why are they important? Are markets good for renewables? Are renewables bad for markets? And so forth. And then we'll kind of close on, you know, what's next? What are some of the big issues? So a lot of this, I think, you know, I think we're covered some of the previous talks you may have seen, just sort of how markets started. You can see the ISO and RTO markets are there on the upper right. Let me see if you see my mouse still. That is the 7 US organized electricity markets and 2 Canadian organized electricity markets that are through these ISOs and RTOs. So they have a lot of these features, including administrating the wholesale energy markets and some of these other markets like the ancillary services, transmission rights, and in some cases, capacity markets. And so these started around the late 1990s, early 2000s with FERC Order 888. and FERC Order 2000. A lot of the RTOs, particularly the three in the Northeast, were formed out of these tight utility power pools. So there were these utilities that realized that they were fairly small, but they could have some economic savings by having a way to trade with each other, where you can kind of do this economic dispatch that monitored the transmission constraints across all of these utilities, and then trade economically across utilities. So they didn't have things like prices yet, but really it was a way for these utilities to transact with each other. So, particularly with New England and New York and in PJM, those utility power pools formed into these ISO and RTO markets. Those markets are relatively unchanged in terms of the geographic scope. And then we had other regions like MISO, Mid-Continent ISO, Southwest Power Pool, that formed a little bit later on, and not necessarily from the power pools that existed for many years before those, but those have expanded over the last 10 years, with MISO South expanding the MISO region, SPP North expanding the SPP region. And then, of course, as many of you are very familiar with, we now have these imbalance markets. The Western Energy Imbalance Market that is operated by California ISO, that you can see in the orange colors here, and then the Western Energy Imbalance Service operated by SPP that you can see with the blue colors on this chart right here. There's also something called the Southeast Energy Exchange Market, kind of a way to form some prices, but show, basically transact with utilities in that Southeast region. Probably won't really talk about that much, but that is another market that also exists. So what does a market aim to accomplish just at a high level? I think the big thing is innovation, right? And when you get to why were these markets formed, why are they in place? A big part of that is just having a way where an entity can innovate and find a way to do something more efficiently or do something more reliably, and provide more value to the system. And the market really provides the price signals to do that. So, just making sure that there's a way for new technologies to enter and compete. Markets are there to help with investments, sometimes more heavily than in others. And in some cases, and in a lot of cases, as in the United States, the states have a big role in that investment, and planning has a big role. But the markets should have a big role in what gets investment, and to put some of that risk onto the investors rather than the ratepayers. The markets also play a role to accomplish a way for both suppliers and consumers to hedge. And if there's uncertainty, if efficiency causes that uncertainty, can participants hedge against it? Is there a way for there to be some insurance against some of the volatility that can happen? And then finally to operate. So making sure that there's incentives for all of the different individual entities to lead to a reliable operation of the system. So first, talking about market structure, and I'm going to go through a lot of these pretty quickly, but I think we'll share slides afterward. But when I talk about market structure, it's really kind of the responsibility makeup. Who does what, right? And that's more of a legislative decision as opposed to the regulatory decision that has been in place for many years, and it differs across a lot of regions. So just as some examples, this is the market structure in the Northeast US markets. So you have the ISO, which is the combined system and market operator. And then you have the transmission owners and suppliers, which are two separate entities. Then you have the Midwest regions, and most of the states in SPP and MISO, where again, the ISO RTO is the same, operating both the system and the market. But in this cases, we still have vertically integrated utilities, and where the transmission owner and the generation supplier are the same entity, even though they're participating in that market. So here we go to here in Colorado and in other places across the West outside of California, where we have really this vertically integrated entity that's the system operator, the transmission owner, and the supplier, all as a vertically integrated utility like PSCO and Xcel Energy, and then a separate market operator like SPP or California ISO. And then we have the Southeast, really kind of the same vertically integrated utilities in the Southeast, but in those cases, there isn't a market operator. So just showing there's a lot of variety. Going into Europe, you have a whole different structure where the market operator is actually separate from the system operator, where the system operator and the transmission owner are actually the same entity that's sort of operating the transmission lines that it owns and maintains as well. And then another piece is just the retail choice areas, usually coinciding with that left side where the transmission owner is separate from the supplier, but not necessarily. And that's where the transmission owner and the retail load serving entity are not necessarily the same entity either. So that's market structure. And, just kind of going through, I'm going to do these really quick just for sake of time, but you'll see I'm going to start adding these circles that show the different market structures and designs across the United States, going from non-market to having this platform to make transactions such as the Southeast Energy Exchange market, to then having efficiently formed prices and congestion management, like the energy imbalance market or the energy imbalance service, to then a greater volume of transactions, like the extended day ahead market or markets plus, where now you have the day ahead, where there's just a much larger volume of energy being transacted, whereas with the energy imbalance markets, you really just have a very small amount that's not through the bilateral transactions. And then getting into an ISO and RTO, consolidating the balancing area, having things like reserves over one large footprint, having transmission planning and other things that go along with it. And then finally, maybe the largest circle is some of the Northeastern ISO RTOs where there's restructured, the utilities are restructured, the generation transmission has the generation's been divested from the transmission companies. There's retail competition and centralized supply procurement. So definitely not necessarily saying that the bigger the circle, the better. The bigger the circle, really, the more functions that the market has, or the more products, the more components, the more responsibilities that the market has. So most of all of this, I'm talking about wholesale electricity markets, but it's really important to also talk about how this affects retail markets and how retail markets are, have an impact on wholesale markets. So this here is showing the states in the U.S. that have competitive retail choice. So those are in the dark blue. Now I'm going to overlay on top of that the ISO and RTO map. And it's not perfect, but best you can do without a graphics person to help me. So now you got this kind of two maps, and just try to look at it closely. You have the ISO maps and you have the retail choice maps kind of on top. And so you have some of these regions like in the Southeast again, and we can think about this. There's no colors. So there's only one grocery store in town, and that grocery store sources all their food from the same farms and the same factories that they own. Okay, so I'm going to go to this grocery store. I kind of know what they're going to have and what they're going to sell me at what prices they're going to sell me at, that kind of thing. But there's only that one grocery store in town. And now we're going to go, like in the South, in the SPP region, some of the MISO region, where you have the ISO over that footprint, but not the retail choice colors, the retail competition colors. So you can think about it this way: there's only one grocery store in town. I got to go to that one grocery store, but they continuously try to find, better food, cheaper food, healthier food from different farms, different factories, trying to make some deals with those suppliers of the groceries. And then finally, we get to places like the Northeast and in Texas, where we have both the ISO RTO colors and the retail competition colors on top of those. And I can think about this as well. Now I can go to any grocery store I want, and those different grocery stores have different ways of selling me these products. Maybe they have different coupons, different sales, but they're also trying to get their supply from different farms and factories at different times to really try to, find the best food for its customers. So just a way to think about how retail and wholesale, because sometimes you hear things like, there's a market here, or there's restructuring here, or, it kind of depends on what you're talking about. And all of these things have different impacts on things like what the retail price is, what you pay as a consumer at your home. And so I think it's really important, what you're probably seeing so far is just how much variety there is, even just here in the United States, from the wholesale markets to the retail side, and the market structure, and everything else. And and that's true, whether that's unfortunately or not, depending on how you look at it. But there is a lot of variety, and there's a lot of reasons why that has come to be, based on some of the decisions that are made by states and by the utilities within regions, and other things. So now getting into the market design side, looking at some of the different timelines that we have. So we might start with these 20 years or multi-year long-term power purchase agreements. Maybe not 20 years so much anymore, but multi-years, looking in advance, moving towards the centralized forward capacity markets that look 3 years in advance, to the prompt capacity markets that might be looking a year in advance or a few months in advance, as well as the financial transmission rights auctions, which are kind of around that same time frame, clearing a few months before the annual period that they're auctioning for. And then moving towards the day-ahead energy markets, day-ahead ancillary service markets, then into your real-time markets, and of course, afterward into your settlement procedures and so forth. So very high level, just kind of seeing what some of those timelines are. That's pretty consistent across all of the North American electricity markets. So this is, some of these topics I'm going to really brush on. Would love to talk more about them if you have questions, but probably won't talk too much more about these. But what I like to show is this is U.S. electricity market design in a nutshell. All of the U.S. regions have all the things that you're seeing on this screen. And these are very important things. So all of the regions have marginal cost pricing in all of their auctions. So the price is uniform, and it's calculated based on what's the marginal cost of providing the next increment of that product. And that's the same really around the world, essentially, although there's some differences in some products. But here in the U.S., that's really the case for any of the auctions that are cleared by the ISOs and RTOs. The next is a highly granular nodal pricing for suppliers. So most ISOs will have, several hundred pricing points, maybe a few thousand, for the suppliers, not necessarily for the loads. But for the generators that are supplying energy, there is a price at every substation that the generator is connected to, and those are impacted by the transmission network. They all have what's called a security-constrained centralized unit commitment and a 5-minute centralized economic dispatch. So every ISO, and this includes the energy imbalance market and an energy imbalance service, all have prices that change every 5 minutes, right? So, and they could change substantially, right? You could, and this is always a good cocktail discussion of, especially things like happening during the Super Bowl when people go and open their fridge all at the same time. But prices and auction clearing for the real-time market through the centralized dispatch happen every 5 minutes for every ISO. Every ISO also has day-ahead markets in addition to the real-time markets for both energy and their ancillary services. Every ISO has what we call 3-part offers. These offers include energy, no load costs, which is basically the cost of just being online, and startup cost, the cost from coming from a offline position to an online position. And they all have for lack of a better term, partially convexified prices. So they try to include all three of these offers into the price. They all do it in a different way. And they all have make-whole payments. So what a make-whole payment is if I am the ISO and I've asked you to do something as part of the market clearing, if you do it and it turns out that you have a negative operating profit from listening to the directions that the ISO gives you, I, as the ISO, will make you whole. All the ISOs have technology-specific participation models, so each technology kind of has a different way to interface with the market. They all have this co-optimized energy and ancillary service markets. So things like operating reserve have a cost associated with providing reserve. And all of the markets look at the cost of providing energy and these services together when they clear their auctions. Excuse me. All the ISOs also have financial markets that they run, and these include locational hedging, these financial transmission rights that I might talk about very briefly just in a bit, and financial markets for converging the day-ahead and real-time markets. And then finally, all of the ISOs include reserve shortage pricing. This is a very important component because it really is what drives price spikes. So if you hear things like, oh, PJM had, or ERCOT had, $9,000 prices or $5,000 prices, or whatever these ISO, whenever you hear some of those types of things, that's really most of the time being driven by these reserve shortage prices. And that really what happens is when the market does not have enough reserve, it will set the price at this administrative value that's not associated with any bid of any generator. And that clearing price is very important because first it has incentives for trying to get every generator to be on and to supply as much energy as it can because the system's short during operations, but it also has some long-term signals as well for understanding how to recover some of the fixed costs for making investment decisions. So these are 9 things that I think are really important that are really common across all of the ISOs in terms of market design. Would love to chat about any of these if you have other questions, but just want to kind of share those big pieces. This will be a part of SPP's RTO West. It'll be a part of the regional organization that's part of California ISO right now. Most of these, not all, will be part of Markets Plus and EDAM. Things like the financial markets, ancillary services, reserve pricing, that will not be a part of Markets Plus or EDAM. So one thing I like to kind of joke about sometimes is, we talk about prices. It's like, well, if I get my multimeter and I plug it into an outlet, I can see what the voltage is, see what the current is, things like that. Is there a setting to see what the price is? And the reason why I say this is because we, as market operators and market designers and regulators and stakeholders, we've invented this thing. We've invented these prices. So the LMP goes by locational marginal price. It exists in every ISO and RTO, including the EIS, including EIM, and Markets Plus and EDAM. And we've made it up. And there's a lot of properties that come with it. A lot of it is coming from the software. When we say things like the marginal cost of energy, that drives what it is. But actually, we can do with it whatever we want. And I think it's really important because when this question comes up of what happens when you have a lot of renewables that are all bidding at zero, what does that do to the price? And what will that do if they're all doing that in the future? And it's just really important to think about, what does it do today and what might it need to do tomorrow? A lot on here. These are just all the things that affect electricity prices, obviously fuel costs, but there's a lot of other things. And that's really the point I want to make here, is that there's a lot of things that go into how those electricity prices, and this is just talking about wholesale prices. So once you get into retail, the rates that you pay at home all of this and then some, right? So just to try to make that point that there's a lot of things that can impact how that price is formed and really what the calculation is for that price and what drives it. And sometimes I when I teach courses at universities and things like that, give some of these more detailed LMP examples. I'm going to go really quickly through this one, which is just a 2-bus example, just to emphasize, what happens when there is a transmission constraint. So in this example, we have all of the load is at bus 2. We have a cheaper generator at bus 1 and a more expensive generator at bus 2 that's at the same location as all of the loads. So maybe bus 2 is the city, and bus 1 is the generating plant that's further outside in a rural area. But there's a transmission constraint of 100 megawatts between those two locations. So what happens if there's a load of 90 megawatts at bus 2? What do we see as the LMP? Well, if there's 90 megawatts of load and my generator at bus 1 can operate up to 150 megawatts at $20 per megawatt hour, and that 90 megawatts does not impact the transmission limit across those two, across the line, then I can get all of the load from bus 2, all provided by generator 1. And the next increment, let's say if there's 91 megawatts of load, is also going to come from that generator at bus 1. So the LMP is going to be the cost of the generator at bus 1. It's going to be $20 in both locations. But what happens if the load is 120 megawatts at bus 2? Well, in that case, I can't keep pumping power onto the transmission line because I run into that limit. So I can get 100 megawatts from generator 1, and that's all I can get because I can't overload the line. There's a thermal limit on the line. It can cause issues. It could sag into a tree. Other things can happen. But it's we want to keep that flow on its limit, which means I now have to get 20 additional megawatts from the generator at bus 2. Well, now I can think about, well, what's the LMP at both locations? Well, at bus 1, if I have one increment of demand, that's not going to impact the line limit. I can still get that from generator 1. It has more capacity. So actually the marginal cost of serving that load at bus 1 is still going to be $20 because I'm getting it from generator 1. But at bus 2, I can't get any more generation from generator 1 because of that line limit. I have to get it from generator 2, the generator at bus 2. And that's where we get this price separation, a difference in prices. The price at bus 1 at $20 and the price at bus 2 will be $100. And just really quickly, one other example of what if it's 160 megawatts, but we had a higher limit. Well, in that case, the next increment of demand at either location is going to have to come from that generator bus 2. So that's just a couple of ways of how you can see that marginal cost pricing work and how those locational prices can be impacted from transmission constraints. And so where do revenues and market incentives come from? So of course we have these bilateral agreements that are happening all the time across buyers and sellers that are really outside of the ISO RTO markets. They may know about them or they may see some of that just to help with the settlements, but it's really outside of their markets. But otherwise, the supplier revenue is coming from the energy markets, the capacity markets where they exist, and the ancillary service markets. That's the three places where those revenues happen. And then in the energy markets, we actually have this three-part incentive where we're trying to get these signals to do the things that we want these entities to do, these assets to do, that will lead to a reliable system that will keep the lights on, but will also make sure that we're not overloading the transmission system, not violating other reliability standards that we have, and also having an efficient management of the system using the least cost set of resources to supply energy. And so obviously the energy price is a big part of that, but there's also the make-whole payments, which I mentioned briefly earlier, and there's also these penalties. So if you don't do what the ISO tells you to do, and you have control over that, there's going to be a deviation penalty, and that's there to help make sure that, across all these three signals, that the individual resources, the generators, batteries, demand response, are all doing the things that are leading to a least cost, efficient solution and a reliable solution. So next I wanted to talk about ancillary services, and a big chart here. I've used this chart for many years. It's just one way of showing all the different types of ancillary services or grid services or essential reliability services. There's all kinds of different names and plenty of literature out there on describing this. But we'll look at kind of the different types of operating reserve, which is really just, okay, if I'm providing energy, I'm going to hold back a little bit from the maximum amount of capacity that I can provide at my generating station, so that if something happened, I can then increase it so that, then I can accommodate that condition. That's really what operating reserve is doing. There's lots of different reasons for it. There's lots of different time frames for it. That's where you're seeing all the separation, but that's really what operating reserve is. Then we also have planning reserve, which is really your capacity, the iron in the ground, just having it there. Your voltage control, reactive power and reactive power reserve, black start restoration, the types of facilities that can start the system after a wide-scale outage or after islanding, and then short circuit contribution. And there's a lot of other services out there too. But really what I show here is tying these to the markets, because these services are really important, but we need to have the right signals, the right incentives, so that, well, maybe there's an investment incentive for an entity like a battery to come in so that it knows it can provide the service, but also just knowing there's an incentive for me to hold back energy, to hold back capacity, so that I can provide some of these reserves and provide some of these other good services. I just want to show, how are these services compensated today, or how are they incentivized? So for some of these services like contingency reserve and regulating reserve, there are competitive auctions that exist in all of the ISO RTO markets. In some of these services, like flexibility reserve and capacity, there are competitive auctions that exist in maybe most of them or some of those ISO markets. These in the green, things like ramping reserve and based on the definition there, or fast frequency response, flexible capacity, there's a competitive auction that might exist in one ISO region. It's kind of an emerging thing. The others haven't really seen a need to develop this auction for this competitive market. And then there are other services like voltage support and black start that may not have competitive auctions, but there is some cost recovery. So we try to figure out, what's the cost that you incurred from providing the service or having the equipment to provide the service, and we will recoup those costs. And then some that have no cost recovery at all. And so that's ancillary services. Next is financial transmission rights. And I think I just want to briefly touch on this. When you saw those separation of prices, you saw the fact that the LMP at the load is much higher than the LMP at the generator. So as the ISO, I'm collecting a lot more money than I'm giving to the generators. And does the ISO just put that in the bank? No, it has to give those back to the entities that paid for that transmission service. And financial transmission rights are a way so that you can have that revenue go back to the entities that paid for the transmission service, including ultimately the retail consumers that paid for the transmission service, but also a way for folks to make transactions and sort of hedge against that volatility between the location of the generator and the location of the load. And so the financial transmission rights means that any entity can purchase these rights, and as a bilateral transaction holder, you can then purchase the rights on the path of your transaction, and then be immune to the volatility that's happening and be immune to that transmission congestion that's happening. Now, you can also be a speculator and say a financial entity can also purchase these and try to guess, sort of gamble at whether they can make more money by purchasing the right because of the congestion, the transmission congestion revenue they get. That's another opportunity for entities to have out there. And then kind of the last product I want to talk about is capacity. By the way, there is not a capacity market in SPP. There is not a capacity market in California ISO. I don't believe there will be a capacity, sorry, I should say capacity auction in either of those regions. And so perhaps this is of less interest to us here at Colorado, but I also think it's something that is really important to keep an eye out. All of the eastern regions have a capacity auction, including MISO, the Mid-Continent ISO, and Ontario. And these have a lot of things really trying to centralize the need to meet this resource adequacy requirement, which is basically saying, I need a certain amount of generation installed on my system so that if there are outages or if there's load that's higher than I anticipated, I have a reliable system. We typically use the standard of no load shedding due to supply insufficiencies more than 1 day every 10 years. And so the capacity markets are a way to find the cheapest way of doing that and forming a price for that auction that can incentivize new investments, but also incentivize resources not to retire if they're needed. And a big reason that this exists as well is that with price caps that we've implemented and the fact that maybe just the energy markets just wouldn't have the reliability that we wanted to have through that standard by itself, this allows those resources that maybe aren't really providing energy very often to then have the additional revenue to do so. Looking at the time here, so I think I'm just going to close here with the renewable, just kind of tying this to renewable. So I think many of us will know this, but what are the key characteristics of variable energy resources like wind and solar? And this is kind of the characteristics that can impact the electricity markets and can impact how we operate the power system. So wind and solar are variable. Their output changes through time based on solar radiance, based on the wind speed. They're also uncertain, right? The condition, knowing what that maximum amount of energy will be at any point tomorrow or any point in the future, is we just can't know that with perfect accuracy. We try to forecast it, but it's just, the output of wind and solar is uncertain and it's variable. Wind and solar is also interfaces the power grid through inverters. And that's important for a lot of reasons. It's not a synchronous machine like thermal resources are, like hydro resources are. And that means that it might not inherently provide some of the responses and controls that are important for power system reliability. Now, we've started to kind of invent some controls that can do what synchronous machines can do or can do even better. But still, it's really important to recognize that wind and solar are inverter-based resources, and that has some impacts on things like the ancillary services and so forth. The location of where these are connected. So large-scale wind and solar, often very far from the load. In rural areas, we need a lot of transmission to get it to the places where the load is. Or maybe if it's things like rooftop solar, okay, that doesn't require transmission, but that has other impacts on the distribution system and the potentially implications like lack of observability and controllability from the bulk system and the ISO perspective. And then lastly, cost distribution. So wind and solar, to operate wind and solar is essentially free, outside of some maintenance costs, right? But it has a high capital cost. And this is not a negative impact at all. It just means that it can impact things like the market design, right? If marginal cost pricing LMPs and all the things I talked about before are really based on the operating costs of resource. They're not based on the capital cost of the resource. They're based on the operating costs of different resources. What if all the resources have zero operating costs? How do you set the energy price in those situations? So then, are markets good or bad for renewables? A colleague of mine would often say that markets are good for renewables because they're like sumo wrestlers. They're big and they're fast. So they're big because they're very large footprints over multiple utility areas. That nets out a lot of that variability and uncertainty that I was talking about before, but also expands the flexibility to accommodate that variability and uncertainty. But the markets are also fast. I mentioned the 5-minute dispatch. Those quick markets incentivize that response to catch up to that variability and correct that uncertainty. So that big, fast markets are really good for renewables. It means that we're finding, where the resources are that can help accommodate this. We're netting out those things over time and over space, and we're correcting that very quickly as soon as we see how the conditions are evolving. We're finding the right resources to meet those issues as fast as we can. And then also economic efficiency. These markets lead to low cost, and when you minimize the overall cost of a footprint, you're ultimately minimizing emissions as well, right? And heat rates of different resources are being used, and when you're minimizing those costs with the heat rates, that's leading to lower emissions. You're using zero cost renewables as much as you possibly can all the time, unless there's transmission constraints or other things. So these markets are really, because of how they're set up, they may not be explicitly minimizing emissions, but they do so through economic efficiency. In some cases, and especially here in the West, there are instances where we're including emissions within the dispatch as well. Flexibility incentives, that helps as well. These ancillary service markets, make-whole payments, things like that. Resource adequacy, making sure that we know that the wind is always blowing somewhere, right? And that's good for understanding resource adequacy and making sure that you're doing that calculation right. Transmission, markets bring transmission through that larger footprint that brings renewables to the load serving entities. And then some of a more emerging part of electricity markets, especially in the West, is greenhouse gas tracking and pricing, which can help with load serving entities that are trying to look at their goals and see how they're meeting their clean energy goals. So then what will happen if energy prices, two energy prices, if all supply has zero fuel costs? The answer is it depends. There's a lot of things that go into that. Will the prices just always be zero if we have all renewables? Some have said maybe it will be, but there's a lot of these other things. I'm not going to read through them all that I think will actually make prices on a fully clean, mostly zero fuel cost resource supply mix not look that much different than it does today. And really kind of has to do with what some of those enabling technologies are and so forth. So I've gone maybe almost an hour, and I do want to get some questions. Many of you probably are just as much or more familiar with this than I am. Seeing the chart here with the RTO West on the the top is the Western Energy Imbalance Service as it exists today, and the bottom chart is showing in dark green the expansion of SPP into the Western interconnection, which includes a large portion of Colorado, and also showing the current entities that are participating in the Markets Plus, or that have sort of agreed that they will participate in the Markets Plus when that comes in. Many of you are very familiar with the PUC's rules for utilities to join a market or a day-ahead or ISO or day-ahead market by 2030, many of whom have already said what they are. And then, just kind of the key issues facing electricity markets. I really think it's resource adequacy, transmission policy, data centers, which I didn't even talk about at all during this talk. Happy to answer any questions there. And then how are we really going to treat demand, these electricity markets? So I spoke for quite a while there, but hopefully that was interesting for you all. And I'm happy to answer any questions, and I can stick around for as long as we have questions. So over to you, Pete.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. So I'm just going to go ahead there. It's funny you ended on the data center question. And I'm not sure if you're going to answer this specific question, but maybe just sort of give some high level thoughts. But a question from Scott. What do you think of the Rewiring America idea of having data centers pay to add energy efficiency equipment to homes as a way to free up the power they want to take off the grid, or other mechanisms for data centers to compensate for their impact, I guess might be you want to make it more broad.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not as close to some of the different tariff designs and things that are being put in place in some states, but I'm much closer to some of the stakeholder and regulatory decisions happening on the wholesale side, which is really kind of the same questions of you're bringing as a data center, as we're kind of looking ahead and seeing the growth of data centers and AI data centers really across the U.S., but especially in places like PJM and ERCOT in Texas. That's adding it potentially adding, and it already is adding costs, especially in PJM with its capacity markets. It's already adding costs, which are flowing through to all consumers. And when the capacity market price increases by an order of magnitude from one year to the next. And I think it was, $18 billion in PJM total in the last auction. A lot of that goes to all retail consumers. And so starting to look at the ways of, is there a way to bifurcate that? Is there a way to try to, have more fair cost allocation for all the different things that are happening? And I think, not to speak for these entities, but I've heard many of them talk before. They really want to, take on the costs that they're incurring as much as they can, and as much as is fair. And I think that's, they're coming to these stakeholder discussions in the ISOs, RTOs, and with the utilities and state regulators saying, please let us pay our fair share, and just try to figure out what that is. So I think it's important. I probably didn't answer the question directly, but I know that there's a lot of talk about how to do cost allocation more fairly with this growth in data centers, at the wholesale side as well as the retail side.
Great. Next question is, we just had a presentation the other night on the DC supergrid concept. And how would such a proposal, or if it was executed, how might that affect the market or the markets? Because it would, in theory, tie everyone together.
Yeah, I've heard about this before. In fact, when I was a young engineer, there was this guy George Lohr that used to talk about this, and he had been going all around to all the ISOs talking about how the 2003 blackout would have been avoided if we all had these DC connections across each balancing area. So just in general, having more transmission means more ability to meet supply and demand by the cheapest way you can, right? So there's less transmission congestion. We're going to have some examples now of how to operate a market across a DC tie with SPP and the RTO West. Really, I think that's a big part is, more transmission, whether it's DC or AC, is going to allow more economic resources to get to load. And, that's going to lower prices across the grid and provide more opportunities to mitigate the variability and uncertainty impacts with more flexibility across the places by allowing power to travel further.
Great. Will the market ever shift from we have baseload generation, we don't need renewables, to we have renewable capacity right now, we don't need baseload generation?
I need to think about that question a little bit. So will the market shift from baseload and renewables to having renewables without base load, I think was kind of the
That's what
question.
I'm thinking. And
Okay. Okay. In fact, I can say that we did just have um, a report that kind of looked into like what's sort of the future resource mix, and I think and I think there's been a lot of studies and a lot of other things around that have shown that you very likely cannot have a system that is wind, solar, and short duration batteries by themselves. Now, if we get to some point where we have just substantial demand flexibility, then maybe that could be possible. But I think um, there really has to be this enabling resource that can, provide that flexibility to balance out the variability happening from the wind and solar, but able to do that over a long durations of time, where like the lithium ion batteries just, they're 4-hour batteries, 6-hour batteries. When you have, these droughts where there's no wind, lots of clouds, across a multi-day period, or in the summer, just cost effectively, we need to figure out, a clean energy resource that's kind of that firm, flexible resource that can, provide energy and flexibility over a long duration of period. So that's kind of how. I'm not sure if that was exactly the right question, but or answer to that question, but I think there really is that kind of, and we don't really know what it is. If it's a clean energy resource, I think we're still trying to figure out, can hydrogen be that resource? Can advanced nuclear be it, or what is that resource? But I think there has to be something filling those longer gaps.
Or if you have it, you throw in the hydro. That's what Mark Jacobson always has the water in there too.
Yep.
Okay. How do you think SPP's expansion into WEC will change things for Colorado? Do you expect any impacts to PPA pricing, and what's the timing on these impacts?
Yeah, I think it's hard to move into to see into the future on this, but I think importantly is that you have, like, the real time, yes, and we have the real time prices in Colorado today, right? With the Energy Imbalance Service, we'll have them, with RTO West, and these don't really have a big impact on overall, like, what a load pays, things like that. But they're really important for the direction, right? Because when you're negotiating that PPA, looking at the real-time price of where your generator is or where your load is really one of the first things that you can do. And now you have that data from, having the RTO be a part of Colorado to help make some of those decisions. So I think that's, maybe the most important part. How is it going to change, like, retail prices, things like that? I don't think, that's going to, maybe over the long term, you can see some changes there, but I don't think you'll see that much, immediately. I think that's probably the biggest thing, is just having that data that can help inform some of those, contract decisions that people are making across Colorado.
Okay. What's your view on if ISOs are over procuring capacity slash conservative operations beyond that, the 1 day and 10-year reliability expectations?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's tough, and I think, one of the things that we're starting to talk about is, whether that 1 day in 10 years is the right metric. So that's the first thing. And I think the second thing is whether we're using all of the right data in those assessments. I can tell you that, we're having issues, right? We've in many of these regions, particularly during winter weather, but also during heat waves in the summer, where there is issues where there isn't enough supply to meet the demand, and that has a lot to do with the outages of certain generators and lots of other things. But so given that, I don't think we're necessarily over procuring today, but I do think that there are some better standards to use, and that might be like, rather than just 1 day in 10 years, like Winter Storm Uri and ERCOT, okay, it lasted over a couple of days, but it was one event, within 10 years. And, so someone could potentially argue that was what we designed it for, but we didn't design it to lose, 20 gigawatts of load over, 3 or 4 days, right? So having it, maybe that metric be more on the amount of load that gets lost, or the amount of time that that load shedding happens, I think can all be important, can help improve some of the efficiency there. But I think there's a lot of ways to improve on that planning to make sure we're not over procuring, but I'd say more importantly, not under procuring.
Great. How is capacity maintained in a market without a capacity auction? Sorry.
Well, if I read through that slide, that would have helped probably a little bit here too. So you can see in SPP and California ISO, both ISOs have a resource adequacy target. So they actually will go through the same process, use that 1 day in 10 years, or use, with this reserve margin that says, California says I need to have 17% more capacity than the peak load next year built. And they just don't have a centralized auction to do that. So they'll take that requirement, and then each of the loads will then have to show that they have that capacity. It's getting son's bedtime here, so sorry about that. I'm doing a little talk, bud. Can you go see mommy? Sorry. So they will require the loads to have that capacity. The loads will do their own way of contracting capacity to make that work.
Okay.
So it turns into a bilateral market instead of a centralized auction. Okay. With the exception of ERCOT, and so again, feel free to use this whole table for that question, I think.
Okay. With all these benefits, why isn't every utility in an organized market?
Very good question. I would say that well, there's drawbacks of the ISOs, and I probably didn't touch on those as much as I maybe talked about the benefits. And there's also sort of I hear a lot of times the kind of the loss of control is maybe the drawback from a utility perspective. And maybe there's a lot of ways to mimic the markets, without having the centralized auction and some of the complexities and things with it. A lot of it was just based on, the decisions through the states, decisions that the utilities made. The U.S. really made it, voluntary. In Europe, every country is essentially in the equivalent of an ISO market, because that's statutory. But we made it voluntary. I would say what we're seeing in the West, and what we're seeing to a lesser extent in the Southeast, is a voluntary move towards markets, right? So I think it's kind of empirically showing some of that happening, where you see maybe learning more about what some of the benefits are, and starting to move in that direction, and maybe step by step. So yeah, I think that loss of control is one thing. It's not really a loss of control. It's kind of it's probably not the best way of using it. The utility still has control of its generation. It's just that someone else is asking it to do something with its generation, that you kind of have to follow those directions. So and I think it's really important that what's happening on the retail side, right? So if you do all this on the wholesale market, and we're not really getting that reflected on the retail side, then maybe some of those benefits aren't really, ultimately seen by the retail customer.
Okay. Can you quickly summarize how China's pseudo markets have evolved over the past few years, given their enormous additions to wind and solar?
Um, Funny enough, I'm I'm heading to China in a month to learn about this. So I don't have a good sense of, obviously it's a very different system and how it is, and a lot of it's government run, um, and I'd say that's a lot of how they do these things, and maybe I can the individual that asked that question can probably share a bit more than I know, but in a couple months I'll learn a bit more, since I may be working with one of the regions that's actually implementing a very similar market to what we have in the U.S. Um, but yeah, a lot of that, as just my what I see in what I hear anecdotally and everything else, is that a lot of these decisions are government made, and they can kind of do things that are much harder to do in a place where we have uh, lengthy stakeholder discussions and all the permitting and everything else that comes with what we have in the U.S. And that's a big part of it. But that's a little outside of my knowledge there.
Okay. Is there a different name for community choice aggregations as in California? What is happening on aggregation development for hour ahead markets? Just some general comments on those items.
Yeah. So the community choice aggregations, the CCAs, really as they are only exist in California. So there's not really a similar uh, type of organization in the other ISOs, with the exception that there are, when there's retail competition, there can be other load serving entities. So in Texas and ERCOT, there can be retailers that are serving a very small portion of a community, or as a city that maybe are somewhat similar to the CCAs. But in California, it's really, I think you use the utility or you use the CCA. In other, if you looked at that retail competition map in the other states, it's really multiple entities that you can choose between, that aren't really just for a particular community or particular region, but can really serve a whole set of different regions. So not something exactly the same as the CCAs and the other ISOs, but in places like ERCOT and in certain states that have retail competition, they'll have other load serving entities that serve that role.
Okay. Short term, 5 to 10 years, would the grid expansion between ISOs provide the cheapest way to expand renewables, maintain grid reliability, and lower the prices the consumer pays?
Well, so one big thing, so I think that was saying, across the entire grid, doing that. And I think one thing that does have to happen, that's probably not done as well as it could be today, is interregional transmission planning. Just a lot of times I mean, the ISOs have sort of a role to plan the transmission, within its footprint, and we'll soon be looking at 20 years ahead, um, as part of a FERC ruling, and factor in things like what different policies are into that planning. But I do think there's a lot of efficiencies to be gained by looking across those regions. Doing a interconnection wide, and we have some of this in the West actually, probably more so than the East, because we have WEC, and we have some of the different entities, the West Connect and other entities out here that are doing some of that. But I think interregional planning is something that can help that. But yeah, do the ISOs play a role? I mean, transmission planning is sort of separate from wholesale markets, even though it's done by the same ISOs and RTOs. And I think some of the implementations of the new FERC order 1920 and maybe some other improvements to interregional planning can help with looking at how planning can really deliver clean energy across much larger footprints than the ISOs themselves.
Okay, two remaining questions, and let's wrap it up after these two. I think both really, really good. The first one is, do the electricity markets currently plan for solar Carrington level events or nuclear EMP attacks from space, black swan events? I'm assuming cybersecurity is in this. If not, how much would it cost to be prepared for such events?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think so. Obviously, the ISOs are working with entities like NERC and the utilities for planning for those types of extreme events, just like they do for weather events. Extreme cold, hurricanes, extreme heat, just kind of in the same way as of having a plan for that, kind of looking at, but it's not necessarily built into the resource adequacy mechanisms. Maybe it's hard to put a probability to some of these events, which is sort of what drives a lot of those planning decisions. So a lot of times it's kind of reporting on how you're prepared for some of those types of events. Especially cybersecurity, I'd say is a little bit different than electricity markets, but there's a number of cybersecurity standards at NERC that both ISOs and utilities have to follow. And I mean, we need to be prepared for blackouts. A lot of the markets are really preparing for they're doing everything before the blackout, right? When you have a blackout, there's no more prices, right? There's no more economic dispatch, right? All those things go away. So we need to have sort of separate plans, restoration plans, and sort of built into the system. How do you restore it after any of those types of events? And a lot of that's coming through some of the NERC standards and continually updating when we learn more about that. And, I'd say EPRI has a lot of research programs on all those aspects as well that are working with those organizations to continue to do research on that.
Wonderful. Last question here. How do the very large electricity users like Google affect and interact with the markets?
Yeah, great question. So there are some that like a Walmart that often have participate right in the wholesale markets. And it kind of depends. Again, some of that depends on the states, what the states allow for loads to do. If it has to go through the local utility, or if there's a allowance to participate direct in the wholesale market. Sometimes some of the large like aluminum smelter plants will have wholesale market participation where they're paying the LMPs. Just like the utilities might be as load serving entities. So it kind of depends on the arrangement that they have. And, of course, when they're paying that wholesale fee, they may still have to pay, transmission, distribution costs like you do on a retail bill, separately from that. Which is kind of like how the CCAs might work. So it kind of depends on the arrangement. I think with a lot of these data centers, really interesting to see how that might work. I'd say another big load that has a lot of wholesale market experience is cryptocurrency in Texas, especially. So those, there's 50 megawatt cryptocurrency facilities that participate right in the wholesale market, just like a generator, right? They see the wholesale, they see that 5-minute LMP, they change their consumption, right? Because they're very sensitive to what the price is. It's not worth doing the mining if the price is over $100 a megawatt hour. So you see a lot of that direct participation. What we might see with the hyperscale data centers, I'm really keen to see if there'll be direct wholesale participants, or I think in some cases having that data float to the ISOs is really important because they're the ones that are going to know what their consumption profile is. not necessarily the utility. So whether it's going from the utility to the ISO or directly from the data center to the ISO, either way, I think that data has to be for reliability purposes, but also for market clearing purposes has to happen.
Okay, wonderful. Well, Erik, I want to thank you again for the presentation and answering all of our questions. Incredibly insightful, obviously very complex. It reminds me of just my stock market classes back getting my MBA, but not even, but that's on such a small level. So everyone, I thank you for joining. I will make sure to have the recording attached to the thank you note that'll go out tomorrow. I'll also include a link to the presentation from Steve Johnson of the SPP from last year, so that'll give you some little bit more granular level on where the SPP has been going. And then I also plan on having Steve speak again, probably next spring or early summer as things really start to roll out. And they have some more data and things to talk about when it comes to the not only the EIS, but as the Markets Plus and the RTO rolls out. So Erik, thanks again.
Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.
Yep. Good night, everyone. Thanks.